So yeah, my name is Ben Hale. I work at the Void as an artist generalist. I mostly do a lot of concept art. At least that's been my experience, but I also have a lot of 3D training, and it's ended up that I have done principally 3D at the Void since I've been working there. And since I've been there, we've been able to get a lot of new software, and Substance Painter and Substance Designer being one of many of them. Today, I'm actually able to show you an asset that I've made at work that we'll be implementing in our Ghostbusters dimension up in Madame Tussauds in New York. And this is the Pke Meter from the new film. Love it or hate the movie, you'd probably love it if you actually saw it. This asset was really tough to build. And the modeling itself alone, and the baking and all of that for the textures that you need for Substance alone took about 2 weeks. The fun part is all in Substance Painter. It's the part that I every time look forward to. There is just so much free-form experimentation, and you get to see all of your work really come to life, really start to look real or right, and you have so much control over everything at any given time. Now, computer gods be willing, I hope this runs well enough that I can go over a lot of the things on this particular asset and show you how I built it. And then we can actually go over building a material from the ground up. Do we have any questions so far? I think I saw a raised hand over here a little while ago that I might have ignored by mistake.
Do you want to show them the different parts of the interface?
Yeah. Alright, let's go over the interface first. So, Substance Painter 2 is a little bit new. There's some things in here that I don't know perfectly, but for the most part, down here at the bottom you have your log in case you ever have errors that show up, but the shelf is what you're going to be using the most. It contains all of your materials, all of your brushes, particles, and tools, and all of these lovely textures and files. This is a huge library that they give you right out of the box, and if that's not enough, you can go to Substance Share, log in with your own account, and they have basically everything you could ever need here.
You have to like pay for each.
These are all free. They do have one that you pay for curated quality content, and a lot of this stuff is quality, but you need to be the judge of that. Luckily, because it's free, there's no consequence from trying it and hating it. But yeah, you can do a search, everything. We won't go over how to download it and where to put it. They usually contain that documentation on Substance's site, so we don't need to worry about it. So, first thing that we're going to want to take a look at over here is when you first bring your model into Substance Painter. Let's go to New. I'm going to regret doing this, I know I will. Here we go. So when we go to New, we would want to select our mesh here in Select. Typically, you're going to want to use FBX because FBX actually stores normal, vertex normal information. You're also able to import any of the maps that you've baked, but if you don't have those, you can actually bake inside of Substance Painter. So right over here, on the lower right, there is a texture settings box, and this is where it stores all of the texture channels for your normal, world space, ID, all of that fancy stuff. But also it shows the different channels that you can have effects for up here, and we'll go over that in a little bit. So if you want to bake your textures, we click on Bake Textures right here. Now for most of these you will need to import your high poly model, which can be OBJ. It doesn't need to be FBX. We don't have any of these, so we don't need to worry about that. But you just select which ones you want to bake, the resolution that you want to bake them at, and in most cases you'll get a pretty decent bake. At work, I bake all of my maps in Knald, Knald. It's a really fantastic program, even for indies. In Knald, I'm basically able to get pretty much flawless bakes on my first try, whereas with Substance, it takes a little bit because they do it with raycasting. So once you have everything plugged in, the reason why these maps are important is because every single thing in Substance Painter that you do is derived more or less from this texture map information. That's why they call these smart materials, because, for instance, if you have edgeware, it's going to be pulling information from your curvature map. If you have dirt or dust that collects in the crevices, it's going to be pulling information from your ambient occlusion map. However, you can make these just as easily. Anytime that I want to add a new layer, we go to the very top. I like to use a fill layer because I like to work non-destructively. And I think that's one of the more powerful things of Substance Painter, is that you can work non-destructively to where you just have a fill, a few generators, and you work entirely with a mask, rather than going in there and painting everything. I'm pretty sure. Let's double check. It looks like it's recording. Alright. So we'll go over how these layers go, but I think you guys are going to find them to be quite familiar because the layer and the layer structure that it has is very similar to Photoshop. So one thing to keep in mind is that you can have multiple materials in your project at a time. This one has a separate material for the screen than it does for the rest of the body. And I set it up that way because the screen was going to be displaying an animated texture that our shader and effects artist was going to be creating. Uh-oh, it's loading. This might take a while. So while that's loading after I switched back, does anybody have any questions so far? Alrighty. So, as you're painting, right here on the lower right, you'll notice that we have different channels for color, height, roughness, metal. I have one that I was able to add for emission for the little glowy bits right here. And at any time you can add those channels by hitting plus and adding it from this drop down. Sometimes you'll have baked a map from another program such as XNormal or Knald that you would have very good use for instance the transmissive map. If I wanted to add that, I just simply add it, and I make sure that depending on the kind of map that it is, that we either have it as sRGB or L8 for linear.
What's transmissive map for?
It's really useful for skin, basically. Anything that's translucent. And it's a black and white texture. Essentially the way that it's baked is they will flip the green channel on the normal map and then bake an ambient occlusion from that. And a lot of weird math ends up making it work very effectively. It's different from a thickness map, which Knald doesn't bake but Substance does. They have their different uses. Also, who here knows the difference between linear and sRGB? Nope. That's a little bit of a big deal when it comes to texturing. sRGB is something that you would use for your base color. Reason why is because I don't really know all of the information behind it, but basically it has a different curve to brightness and lighting and rendering versus linear. So anytime you export a mask or something that cannot have that odd interpolation, it needs to be linear, but we'll get to that. Hey, it's almost done loading. We might run into a few problems with me showing this off, so I could probably switch over to the simpler model that I gave all of you guys. Were you able to load that up okay? How's it look?
Wonderful.
Alright, looks like a rock. That's good.
Why am I not surprised it's a rock? You know.
Alrighty. So what we might have to do is just delete all of the layers, and I can start from scratch and show you guys. But basically, to show you a little bit of the structure here, any aspect of this, I will create a material that basically covers the whole thing and then mask it off in a folder. Just like, for instance, if we were working in Photoshop and I created a group, then I could give that group a layer mask. And at any time, I can paint directly on that mask, but I can also add it back. And this is why it's so great to be able to work non-destructively, because in both Substance Painter and in Photoshop, had I done that not on a layer mask but on the actual layer itself, I would have to resample all the colors, which I might have missed. It might be getting modified by tons of things above it. I'd have to hide it. It's an ugly mess. I would encourage you all to get familiar with how a mask works in Photoshop, because it's basically identical in Painter. So let's go ahead and just delete everything so that we can get some better performance and be able to show you all the things that I want to show you. Goodbye forever. Alright. So as you can see, the model still reads pretty decently because I do have all of the information here from the normal, the ambient occlusion, curvature, position. Let's go ahead and create a material. I like to start with a fill layer. Notice all these channels that I have. Let's get rid of transmissive and emissive. Okay. These little channels right here for color, height, roughness, and metal, these are basically the four things that any one of these can affect all at once, or none of them, or just a few. You get to choose. If you want to toggle one of them off, just click it. Notice how it removed that channel from this little drop down. Alright. Let's just modify the color for now. Let's make it a lovely purple.
Your favorite color?
How'd you know?
I said it.
You have good memory. You're freaking me out. Alright. So, this is kind of bland. It's not particularly interesting. So let's go to the roughness really quick. Let's see what we can modify here. I turned on the roughness channel. As I bring it up, it becomes much less reflective, or the reflections themselves are much more diffused. They're dispersed because on a macro level, the surface is actually rougher. Unity uses smoothness, but don't worry, we can export a converted version of that. So for now, we work with roughness. The further that we get to 0, the more reflective and mirror-like it becomes. Pretty neat. Looks like plastic, though. Let's say that we wanted it to look more like metal. There is actually a metalness channel. Its default is 0. As we slide it up, there's just something about the way that light interacts with metal, something to do with the electrons. I don't understand the science, but luckily they've been able to dumb it down in an efficient manner that we just need a black and white texture to represent something as complex as photons interacting with metal. Alright, I would recommend that you, for pretty much the majority of the time, never have any sort of value in between 0 or 1. Any object at any given time is either 0 or it's 1. It's either metal or it's not. Sometimes it is, like maybe a pearl, for example, but for the most part, just keep it simple. Alright, so height. Height information you're not really going to see unless you have a lot of black and white masking going on. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that on a new fill layer with just the height information. So at any time we can actually, rather than just affecting the uniform color, which it has currently, we can give it one of these procedurally generated masks that it has right here. So let's go with something like this. Isn't that hideous? So take a look at a couple of things. When we have this particular fill layer selected, it gives us all these controls. Do we want it to be UV projection, meaning that it's going to be projecting our texture based on the UV islands, which might give us better distribution, but it might also give us seams in places. Or we can do triplanar, which doesn't always play nice, but for the most part, eliminates seams. This is really, really ugly, guys. Let me delete that. Let's do this with roughness so that I don't embarrass myself. Alright. So, typically though, I would suggest that rather than applying these different masks to the actual layer itself, just like in Photoshop, we should use a mask. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and add a white mask for now, because we're going to go ahead and modify that mask. If I want to, I can paint directly on this mask, which we can't see because I don't have anything applied to it. Alright, there we go. That's a lot easier to see. So yeah, more or less you can paint directly on the model like in Photoshop. And you have all these different brushes that we'll get to eventually. But if we wanted to, we could also pull at any time a mask from a texture that we've either imported or comes with the program itself. I wonder why that's not showing up. There it is. Look at that. So our mask is now the ambient occlusion. At any time, we can right-click on it with the mask selected, and we can invert the mask. Notice how it automatically adds a levels. Which we can easily adjust. Add yet another one. So if we go down, if we right click on the mask and we go to fill, we can overlay a bunch more things onto this. This is absolutely hideous. But notice how we can't see it. Why is that? That's because the mask itself has a blending layer. Basically everything that you do in Substance Painter will have a blending mode. So we can go ahead and change that to multiply. And voila, look at that. It's a lot of different effects that we can have, which I would encourage you all to experiment with and get familiar with. It's basically identical to Photoshop. So let's go ahead and take a look at somebody else's smart material. Cross your fingers that it doesn't crash. Yeah, this is going to take a while. Any questions so far while we're waiting? Yes? I've been using it for about a year.
How long did it take you to kind of learn the ropes for it?
It's actually not a terribly complex program, so I'd say maybe a week to get comfortable, but you generally do get a lot better at using it as you experiment. You get more training, you learn more techniques. So I don't know, it's kind of like learning the guitar. Easy to kind of get the hang of, lifetime to master. There we go. Alright, so we get to take a look at all these lovely little layers that he's got here. See how he's doing this stuff. Let's go ahead and hide them. Ooh, fancy. So, it's important to think of your materials as you're stacking different details on top of each other to eventually arrive at the goal that you want, at the look that you want. So this guy started with a base color, which is just this lovely tan color. And he also went ahead and right-clicked and he added a generator and a fill. So first thing that he did was he added this fill, which we can take a look at here. So he's got it set to UV projection, like a scrub. Let's change that to triplanar. There we go. Eliminates all of our seams, more or less. Not quite. So notice how this particular fill layer, it's basically a layer within a layer, and if you have a group, then that's even more layers within more layers. You can go pretty deep with how many masks and layers of things that you have, but these little icons here underneath a fill layer is the lowest level of layers that you can go. So he has a fill within a layer, and he's given this fill a texture, as you can see right there. This fill has on only a roughness channel. He could apply color, but notice how that black and white texture is affecting it not really to our desired. Height would be hideous, and it's not affecting anything. And he's got this filter here called Finish Rough. And for some reason, I think it's because this is an older smart material, we're not really able to get in there and see what exactly it is or change it. Well, let's go ahead and make one. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to go to Add Filter. Oh, look at all these. Let's go to Finished Polish. Filters are a little bit more complex, something that I haven't completely been able to master. But essentially what a filter does is it runs a bit of math. It's a lot like Photoshop and how it does filters. It reads the channels and the maps that you have and even pulls from a couple of them, such as world space normals here and the position map. And it doesn't appear to be making a lick of a difference to anything, so we just won't worry about it. Alright, so that's a really great base that he has to this material. His next layer up is a lovely dirt material. And this particular dirt is just a fill layer with nothing fancy to it but a mask. So one very new thing about Substance Painter 2 that I haven't had the chance to get into is smart masks. So in Substance Painter 1, anytime that you would make a fancy mask using all these different maps that you can pull from, you couldn't save that. And it was kind of a pain in the butt. Luckily, now you have that ability, and it's just as useful as making a smart material. I hope I'm not moving too fast for you guys. Do you guys know what a smart material is? Did I go over that? Okay. Alright. A smart material is like, a smart mask is like a smart material, but it's only one channel in black and white values that you can apply to any of these at a time. So, yep, lovely dirt, which we can go ahead and go in and adjust if we wanted to. We might not have time for that. Alright, surface details. So this particular one has roughness and height. We're going to need to move in closer to see that. So notice how the light is catching on this. Pretty neat, huh? It looks like he's also got another mask editor that he's using here. Alright, next one, edge damages. This one in particular is pulling from the curvature map as a mask with a mask editor. Well, we're not getting anywhere with this. And then a sharpen filter. Let's go ahead and try and recreate that bronze ourselves. So do you guys want to follow along at this point? Because I can slow down a little bit. I'm going to actually show you how to build that material from the ground up. Alright? It's going to look really weird on a rock. Okay, let's go ahead and do this. Okay, go ahead and click on our new fill layer. Let's go ahead and change it to that tannish color. It's going to look like plastic. We'll fix that. Alright, first thing that we're going to want to do, because this is our very base layer, and obviously it's made out of metal, so let's go ahead and do that.
So did you bump that slider all the way to the right?
Yep, all the way to the right. Now things like dirt obviously isn't made out of metal. That's going to affect the final metalness map. There's going to be crevices and dirt that is going to be gray and black, transitioning from metal back to not metal. And that's okay. The problem is that a lot of game engines, metalness workflow is a shorthand. It gets really great results really fast, and it's a lot easier to comprehend and understand, but unfortunately transitions from metal to not metal can be a little bit abrasive in game engines when they render it. The way that Substance Painter is actually displaying it is actually in the specular workflow. So it might be a little misleading, but for the most part, you will get a one-to-one look from Substance Painter to your game engine if you export your maps correctly. Alright, so let's go ahead and add some scratches to the top. Now I'm not going to do what he did, adding layers inside of layers. Let's just go ahead and add another fill layer. We're going to turn everything off except for roughness. So first thing that we can do, we can either pull from here and do a search, but lately I've really enjoyed just pulling from here in the procedurals, and we have a lovely search bar. So let's go ahead and search for grunge. Let's find one here that looks like it belongs on metal. Something that's kind of high contrast. Maybe this one. Alright, so we can just left click and drag over into that roughness channel right there. Ooh.
That's grungy.
Yeah, that's pretty grungy. So it's going to look, you're going to find that at any given point, as you're working on a thing, it's going to look hideous for a moment, and then you fix it. It's always going to happen. Don't worry about it. You're not doing things wrong. It's just kind of how the workflow goes. So first thing that we're going to do, since we can see everything really clearly, let's go ahead and maybe bump up the tiling a bit. Ooh, too much. Double click on the bar to bring it up so that you can just type it in. Let's do 6. Okay. Sometimes you'll find that the tiling on this can be a little bit obvious. If you come across that, such as here and here, you can just do a UV rotation, and it won't give you any seams. Helps to break up the repetitiveness a bit. Now notice here, I've got this lovely seam here on the back. The handle is right here, and that's where I put the UV island, because for the most part, people's hands were going to be covering that half. So currently, its projection is in UV projection, and there's a lot of times when it's very advantageous to be using UV projection. Most of the time, I would recommend it. But when you have something that is encompassing the entire thing, I would suggest using triplanar projection. That's going to change the scale of things a little bit. Notice how the details are a little bit bigger again. We'll just have to adjust it once more. Let's change that to, let's say, 10. Bigger the number, the smaller it's going to get, because it's tiling that many times. Okay, let's make it not hideous. First thing that we can do is Right here we can go and change the opacity, but watch as nothing happens. And there's a reason for that. Because right now we are not affecting the roughness channel. We're on base color. Now if we want to affect roughness, we just bring this drop down menu and we go to roughness. And look at that, we can independently affect the opacity and blending mode of each of these layers per channel. That's pretty wild. Also, this is still pretty ugly. So let's go ahead and fix a couple of things. Alright, so in our grunge settings here, it's given us a couple of nice controls here. Now this grunge was originally created out of Substance Designer, and it's made with a node network, and they've exposed certain parameters, and those parameters are made available right here. So balance is just basically contrast, and we're going to want to have some kind of higher contrast here. Sorry, no, contrast is contrast. Balance is its histogram scan. I'd like to have more shiny than matte. Sorry if there's a matte in here. Alright. I'm wondering if I do want to affect the metalness. Because if we do, unfortunately, because I put it on a layer instead of on a mask, I don't have independent control over that value. So we'll just leave that alone. That's going to need to be pretty subtle. Let's really quick go to our base layer, make it a little bit shinier. Okay, so we can have a couple of more layers of that, but let's go ahead and add some grease and grime in the crevices and in the cracks and everything. So, new fill layer. Let's go ahead and choose kind of a darkish red maybe. Not terribly saturated. For the most part, grease and dust is in fact not metallic. It's also not particularly reflective, but we don't need to add any height information to this. Alright, so this time I'm not going to add a grunge map to the base color or roughness or metallic channel itself. I'm going to right click and we're going to go to add Bitmap Mask. So I apologize in advance if the maps on the file that I gave you have odd names. Just try and find the ambient occlusion texture. So look at that, we have our mask, and it's given us this little fill drop down here, which we also have independent control over its opacity and its blending mode. But everything's inverted because I want to have everything in the crack, so I can just right click with the mask selected. Notice the blue box around it. I right click on it and I go to Invert Mask. And it's actually just given me a levels control, and I hope you guys all know how to use that. Let's find a nice balance in there. Okay. Seems awfully smooth for a transition though, doesn't it? Also, it's a little bit too opaque. Let's tone that down. Okay, so that's fine. We can go ahead and add another layer within the mask to overlay on top of that so that we can get a combination of the ambient occlusion and something a little bit grungier. So I like to just go to Add White Mask, and that was the wrong thing to do. Right click, Add Fill. There we go. We all like fill. Let's go ahead and find a different grunge and just click and drag and hang on a second, it's not responding. There we go. Okay, this one we're going to want to have tile quite a bit. So let's say 15. We're going to want to have 0.15. There we go. It's a little bit tighter. Is it? Yeah, okay. I didn't waste your time. All right. So, yeah, this is hideous. Let's go ahead and fix that. First of all, I usually like to do edge wear, or highlights, not wear, with color dodge. And that is definitely way too strong. Let's tone that down. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that we don't need height. We'll probably want to use roughness and color, but our metalness, it's still made out of metal. Just because its edges are getting taken out doesn't mean that it suddenly becomes plastic or chalk. Alright, let's see what kind of difference that's actually making. Not too bad. Alright, seems too uniform. Let's go back to the mask. Oh, do you guys have any questions? I'm not moving too fast, am I? Okay. Alright, let's go back to the mask, and we're going to add one more filter. And this filter is pretty fun. It's called Warp. So you can kind of start to see what this does. And you can also affect the granularity of that warp just by affecting the tiling. Make it too high and it's just really ugly. Okay. Let's say that we want those edges to be kind of dinged up a little bit. So if we really wanted to, we could affect the height here, turn on that value, and just bring the height down, but I think we're going to want to have a little bit more control over that independently from this particular one. So, add another layer. Do be warned about adding too many layers though, because then it has to load all of them and calculate all of that. Okay, this is only going to be affecting the height channel. So let's go ahead and go over to our height channel here on our layers menu, in addition to our channel menu. We're going, yeah, go ahead.
So in Photoshop, when you have multiple layers, you can merge the layers together, so it's just one layer rather than
Yeah, you can't do that here.
You can't do that?
No.
Okay.
That would be pretty neat, but that would be pretty terrifying as well. The trouble with that is in Photoshop you're only working with 4 channels. You're working with R, G, B, and alpha. Unless you work in CMYK, like the guys in the photography lab, but you're not in that department. So if you were to merge these channels in Painter, there's just way too many diametrically different channels to merge that it would just not be possible. However, you essentially do that when you export. And we'll get to that. We're going to export the maps of this project, and you'll see that everything is flattened down essentially to its final form. Alright, so this layer is only affecting height. You'll notice that as I slide it up and down, it's not really making a difference. One, we don't have parallax mapping or tessellation in Substance Painter. That would be rad, but it would probably crash everybody's machine. But two, the only way that you're really going to see any sort of difference is if we have gradients. So I'm just making the overall value of the height a little bit less than 0. That way it's going to sink in as opposed to poke out. And don't worry, because when we export, it will also, I bumped into the microphone, it will also modify the normal map from the height information that you give it, which is really awesome. So if you want to add this kind of detail in Painter, you don't need to do it in ZBrush or in Maya, for the most part. It's up to your discretion if you like doing that kind of thing. But you have a lot more granular control over this. Let me pause for a moment. Have you guys noticed how we haven't done any painting yet? I'm sure you're all a little bit disappointed. Well, there's a reason for that, because Substance Painter might not be the best thing at painting. it does do very, very well at managing all these different layers and these channels and essentially taking the tedium out of how you would basically texture in Photoshop anyway. I mean, do you really do that much hand painting in Photoshop, or do you just grab a texture overlay and stick it on there and call it good? Maybe take a map from your curvature or from the green channel from your object space normal map and multiply that over your diffuse. I mean, that's really the stuff that you guys are basically doing. We can do hand painting near the end in areas that we need to. What we're trying to do here is overall create a material as quickly as we can using, you know, all the tools that are given to us, or even making our own, and we're just taking the tedium of texturing out. I hate to disappoint you guys, but if you want to do hand-painted textures, Photoshop does support OBJs, or you can use Mari. But, Mari? M-A-R-I? You guys can go ahead and take a moment to look it up. Keep in mind, indie licenses aren't too bad, but a studio license is about $5,000. I haven't taken a look. Can somebody tell us how much indie is? 1,200 euros. That's about like $1,500. It's not terrible. Oh yeah, there you go. Oh yeah, how much is that? That either means free or definitely not free, which is why they wouldn't tell you the price. Alrighty. So I'll show you hand painting stuff eventually. I mean, how much time do we have? We've already spent an hour?
Yeah, we're almost at an hour.
Okay.
We'll probably want to stop this recording and start a new one so that it's
okay.
Not real big.
Actually, I'm doing it in 17-minute intervals because that's how the camera does it.
Oh, is that how you set it up?
That's good there, but we've also got one running on
right, yeah.
tap.
Uh-oh. All right, let me go ahead and take a moment to do that right now.